name is Alejandro O'Rourke, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HTTP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote the access, adoption, and full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. Through our community engagement, congressional education, and by serving as a national voice for Latinos in tech and telecom policy, HTTP member organizations work to support the social, political, and economic advancement of Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. Today, having broadband access is inextricably linked to our health, our well-being, and our economic security. This is especially true for the Latino community, for the Black community, Indigenous communities of color, as well as rural and low-income households or families who are experiencing economic hardship because of the coronavirus and who face compounding obstacles to establishing and sustaining a reliable at-home broadband connection. Central to the solution of bridging the digital divide is our ability to extend broadband infrastructure to every home at an affordable price. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Michael Powell, President and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, to our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything as a part of our inaugural Digital Inclusion Summit. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really important for me to include your perspective because you've been leading efforts for broader digital inclusion across multiple fronts for over 10 years. As someone who has served as the chair of the FCC for both President Clinton and President Bush, your efforts led to a rapid transformation of communications markets and into the digital age. And now as the CEO of NCTA, you work to promote technology and entertainment future that will both advance innovation, unleash connectivity, and exceed customer expectations for a wide range of services. So I wonder, do you mind kind of starting us off today by sharing a little bit of your background, your passion for inclusive tech, and what you're hoping to accomplish during your tenure as the CEO of NCTA?
Yeah, well, first of all, Alejandro, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about your first inaugural summit, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Let me tell you a quick story that's kind of funny. When I set off to college the first time, my father did something very odd. Odd for him because he's kind of a cheapskate. And I was shocked that he was insistent that I go off to college with a personal computer. At the time, that was unheard of. No one I knew owned a personal computer. It was exotic. When I arrived on campus, I was the only person I knew who owned a personal computer in their dorm. And my father had this sort of prescient view that this was going to be important. And sometimes that's where the life of a kid starts, being shown a new opportunity through technology like that. And ever since, that sparked my passion in technology and communication policy. It drove me in that direction. I was an Army officer after getting out of the service. I went to law school and fell in love with administrative law and regulatory work, and the two passions came together in the form of telecom policy. It's led me through lots of intersections with that topic at the Justice Department Antitrust Division, in private practice, at the FCC, as you mentioned, and now at NCTA. Leading NCTA over the last decade seems to me to be marked by one really pretty important transformation, which is, for the longest time, cable TV, a pretty formative and important service, was essentially a form of leisure. It was television. It was new and better television, and while it certainly offered information, news, and the like, that was really its biggest calling card. And I think what we've been doing is sort of leading the transition to where broadband is actually at the core of a good part of the industry. And that service is less about leisure and more about an essential good that's really critical in the lives of our citizens. And so during my tenure and with our organization, we've really been managing both that transformation as a business practice, as policy objectives, and as social commitment. And so I think for many years, we've been working to kind of deepen and expand that commitment toward national well-being, where broadband and internet sits at the center increasingly of people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, Thank you for that. I think you're 100% right. So I think that when we specifically talk about digital inclusion, the term itself kind of clearly conveys the idea that there are people and places that have been historically excluded from the benefits of digital opportunity. So from your perspective, do you mind sharing how you think we got here? Who do you think is most impacted? And how are you working with industry leaders and policymakers to establish more inclusive connectivity policies to expand digital tools to every home?
Yeah, when I hear you say how we got here, I think what first jumps to my mind is a more accurate framing is probably, the work of unfinished business. Broadband deployment has probably been the fastest deploying technology in the history of the world. And so we have much to celebrate in terms of how many people we reached and how quickly. But is always true with network infrastructure because of the economics, it gets really hard when you get to that last portion of the population. That was true with electricity, that's true with indoor plumbing and water, it's true with roads, it's true with almost every network infrastructure. I think it's smart to realize there's two kind of distinct problems caught up in the terms of digital divide, digital inclusion. We like to say digital equity. The first is people who don't even have the infrastructure to begin with. They are unserved. The network's yet to reach them. This is essentially a network economic problem of enormous proportions. Put simply, if I got to run a wire between two homes that are 300 miles apart to pick up two customers paying $50 a month, that is a heinous economic equation that's just insurmountable by most economic and financial models. So to reach the unserved it necessitates the power of the government being a partner with private sector in how to close that gap, because we're talking about there's only two ways to solve that problem, which are find more revenue, find more money to offset the enormous expense of reaching those people, or lower the costs. And you can lower the costs through technology, you can lower the costs through lower regulatory barriers, you can lower the costs other ways. But the big issue in this case is the sort of scary sums of money that would be required to get to 100%. The second problem is also encompassed in your concerns, but they're distinct. They're what I would call the adoption and affordability issues. Communities that have the infrastructure available to them, but nonetheless don't subscribe. We've been looking at that problem for 2 decades, and it is more complex than the first. It is littered with a myriad of explanations. One is we're surprised, no matter how different we think about it, how many people say they don't value the service enough to purchase it. Whether that's true in an exercise of free choice, or whether it's also because they don't fully appreciate the essentiality of it to being full participants in society. The other aspect of it is affordability. Even though I think the rates are generally pretty good, they're expensive for some people and some families, and that particularly affects urban poor, where we find a lot of communities of color. It affects low-income families. It affects large families who have limited disposable income. But also, to get on the internet means you have to have the equipment. You have to have devices. You have to have a laptop. You have to have an iPad. You have to have a Wi-Fi router. You have to have a modem. It's not a simple, one device solution. So, we have that part of the problem. And then finally, I think the most underappreciated problem is the skills required to be effective. I remember in the early days of the internet, opening up a web browser and staring at the page and not really having the slightest idea what to do, where to go, what to experience. I think we take for granted that this thing is a pretty passive medium if you don't know what you're doing. It'll just stare at you. And I think we have to be committed to helping people develop the skills and the education necessary to take full advantage of these services. So all the programs that we're involved in, both on our own and in partnership with the government or other community organizations, is around these two buckets. On the unserved, it's really a question of stronger government partnerships and greater flow of consistent capital. This is where Congress could do more. This is where the FCC does a lot, but it's far short of the numbers that would seriously take us to the next level. Adoption and affordability, I think, one, there's an education effort around value, but on the affordability side, I think it's incumbent for the country to think about How do you provide low-income access affordability programs? Our industry is proud of what we do in this regard. Almost all of our companies have a low-income program, on average offering broadband around $9.95, $10 a month. But the government has programs as well. And I think one of the things this country's never quite grappled with is broadband going to be part of the social safety net? You know, the way that we provide unemployment insurance or SNAP, or the ability for people to feed each other, if we believe that this is an essential service, are we going to find a way to include some sort of support for those who are down on their luck or out of work or are struggling with the expenses associated with the service, just like with electricity or anything else? That's something we don't currently have. It's something I would be supportive of being engaged in order to find solutions around.
So I think that you're absolutely right. You know, you kind of you brought up a lot of interesting points about, you know, adoption, about affordability. And I think that, you know, COVID-19, the global health crisis has really kind of proven itself to be a perfect case study for what could and what did go wrong, and expose the depths of the digital divide for Latino, Black, Indigenous communities of color, and people, like you mentioned, living in rural or underserved kind of urban parts of the country. You know, and COVID-19 has also tested the resiliency and capacity of our telecommunications networks. So how has kind of our broadband infrastructure fared in comparison to other parts of the world? And how have your kind of members specifically kind of provided or responded to the pandemic to ensure that everybody that wants to is able to connect to the internet?
Yeah, I mean, COVID's been a perfect storm, right? I've never experienced anything like it, nor do I think the modern world has in recent times. So you're right to describe it as a case study, but it's also probably the greatest test ever for the broadband network infrastructure. I don't think we could have done a scenario analysis and imagined an environment in which almost suddenly and without warning, the entire country was told to go home, leave school, leave the spaces of societal interaction, and grab onto a broadband connection to conduct the remaining aspects of their lives. I mean, that is a full-on, all-hands test of the quality and capacity of the network. And I think the one thing that we're finding out, you know, one, we thought we were prepared, but, you know, you never know. I think we're very pleased with what the results have been. In essence, I think the network has passed that test. It's performed exceedingly well under significant surge. You know, we probably had upwards of 20% increase in downstream traffic. We've seen higher than that, 30, 35% of upstream traffic with people video conferencing, et cetera, and kids in school during the day. But we immediately jumped on that. And, you know, we even published a public dashboard in which we pulled all of our companies together to do a network evaluation once a week. And we posted those results for the public to see. We put in place micro-monitoring programs, and we had rapid deployment forces to deal with any congestion. And I think on balance, most people would say the performance was excellent, and particularly compared to some of the stresses we saw in Europe when they had to ask Netflix to downgrade their speeds and others to take preventive action so the network would perform well enough. We didn't have to take such measures here. I also want to say quickly, I think I'm proud of my industry that we might have passed the social test too. You know, I remember turning to the CEOs of our industry and I said, this has to be our finest hour. Our country is really in need here, and we need to find ways to step up. And right from the beginning, when Chairman Pai called on the industry to keep America connected, we were immediately there. And in fact, the cable industry took a lead position in arguing that that pledge should continue throughout the school year, so we could get our kids to the summer break effectively. But we kept people on the network. We didn't disconnect people. That was an important commitment. More importantly, I think we expanded our low-income access programs. We gave consumers free service for 60 days, many of our companies. We increased speeds, we increased eligibility. We have Wi-Fi hotspots all over the United States. The industry opened up those Wi-Fi spots for free to all consumers, all citizens, all users. And the area we're focused most heavily on now is schools. We announced a big initiative called Bridge to Broadband in partnership with Education Superhighway to create a discounted offering that schools could purchase on behalf of all their unserved students, so the students themselves would have little to no expense associated with going to school remotely. Companies like Comcast have done lift zones where they're putting industrial grade Wi-Fi inside boys and girls clubs and community centers for people. Many of our companies have extended free periods of use, and many have made big financial commitments. Cox recently announced a $60 million commitment to helping schools and students learn remotely. So these are some of the things we've done. I think we're proud of how we've performed so far in COVID, but I think we're also very sober that we don't think COVID's going away tomorrow, and that we're constantly looking for better ways to help the country with one of its greatest challenges we've ever experienced.
And so I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that our goal for the Digital Inclusion Summit really is to convene diverse stakeholders to establish real solutions through an intersectional lens that considers how factors such as race, zip code, cultural background, and the ability, to have a unique ability to impact kind of broadband adoption rates and either limits or expands the circle of digital opportunities. So, I would say I would look to you as a representative and influential voice. How are you leading your industry during this time of great change to center the lives and experiences of communities of color to ensure that we are creating a future that is inclusive, equitable, and safe? And I think most importantly, if that future isn't, if the present isn't there yet, then what does that future look like?
Yeah, in our industry, we tend to describe our focus as digital equity. And in a way, we have stepped up and committed a lot of resources to that problem for the long run. Just as an example, you note that Comcast made a $100 million commitment toward that idea. And one of the things we try to do as a trade association with all of our companies is not just have them doing things individually as companies, but how can we aggregate those efforts into kind of a collective impact model where we can say the whole industry is stepping up to some kind of common effort that has greater impact and greater scale. We need to remember that broadband is not provided to people nationally. It's a regional service. If Comcast is doing something great, that's great if you live in a Comcast territory. But if you live in a charter territory, whatever Comcast is doing is of no value or interest to you. So we try to kind of create like almost a virtual company through our efforts so that we get a collective impact on at least the part of the population that cable touches, which also isn't 100%. It's why we need telephone companies and others to be participating. We've also really doubled down on the idea that we have to be part of the community. We have to be in the community. I think the schools thing has really led us to be present, to be, in communion with superintendents, with community activists, with local leaders, with groups like yours to try to better understand the problems and create more wraparound services to help. If I were to sum it up, I've often said this as a Black American myself. I think the promise of there's sort of been three great revolutions in the history of mankind: the agricultural age, the industrial age, and now the information age. I think the information age is the first and only real opportunity a lot of people, particularly people of color, have had any opportunity to enjoy the fruits of that advance. My relatives were picking cotton in the agricultural era. My ancestors were living in legally segregated societies during the majority of the industrial era. This is the first era that may hold genuine promise for us. And I think there really is no future that you can see that isn't rooted in technology. And I think to be a full participant in that future, we got to overcome a lot of barriers in our communities: education, poverty and wealth disparities, access. And in our world, in cable, we're working to provide the essential tools that folks need to get in the game. But how well they play in that game is going to depend on attacking the chronic problems that stem from a history of racial and gender inequality. In a way, just because you're handed a baseball bat doesn't mean, you're prepared to be a good hitter in the major leagues. And so I want our society to see this as a big, comprehensive problem, part of the systematic racism work, part of the growing inequality work, so that we can create a community of people that not only have the tools, but have the skills, the coaching, the training that's necessary to actually succeed and perform well. And if we do that, it's a pretty exciting future for all of our citizens. If we don't do that, we're going to further exacerbate dramatically the inequalities that continue to plague American society.
Yeah, and so you mentioned a couple of times, I think, really this idea of really it's a problem that requires, or I guess achieving the goal of full digital inclusion and universal broadband adoption will really take a collaborative, integrated approach with policymakers, with private industry, and in partnership with local communities. So from your perspective, are there some specific steps that Congress, that regulators like the FCC, broadband providers can take, and that digital inclusion advocates like us can promote to deliver real solutions for diverse communities across the country?
Yeah, of course. There's lots of important work streams here. Number one, keep the lights on. Our society has often a short attention span. And sometimes, these things ebb and flow. There's a meaningful, engaged commitment to improving it, and then it falls off. And you can't get anybody to answer the phone to talk about these issues. So number one, I think spotlights are important. I think creating a spirit of partnership rather than adversarial environment. This is not a solution anybody's going to fix by yelling at anybody. I think providers know this is not a luxury; it's an essential service. I think providers want to reach all those citizens, but they need help. They can't do that last percentage without partnerships with the government, and we need to get on the same team. Look, we got to have a hard conversation about how valuable this is and at what price tag, because we're talking about money that is not, a few stimulus shovel-ready projects at a couple $100 million, which is typically what's been done. We're talking about funding that's an order of magnitude higher. We're talking billions approaching 100 billion if you were really serious about this problem. And networks are not a build it once and then don't bother with it again. They require massive amounts of continual investment. Our industry spends close to $30 billion a year just maintaining and improving the network. So you got to commit to that to the long term. We also need to focus more on how do you lower the costs of deployment. There's two sides to the equation: more money and how to get there cheaper. One of the great advantages we have, there's a lot of technologies available and they have different cost characteristics. To be perfectly blunt, the last 2 to 3% of rural America is going to have to be a wireless or satellite solution in all likelihood, because, from 28,000 feet in the sky, a satellite doesn't make much distinction between New York City and rural Iowa. But on the ground with wires, it's a huge difference. So we have to use technology smarter. We have to get all the providers in the game. In our industry, we continue to be super frustrated by the legacy of telephone regulation and the fact that as we try to tackle broadband, so many of these programs have requirements and qualifications that keep people off the field. The cable industry really wants to get deeper into the game of reaching people, but sometimes we find out that in order to get this money for this program, you have to be an eligible telecom carrier. You have to be something that's a vestige of old regulations that's just prohibitive. So we need Congress to remove barriers like that. The last two things I'd say, Alejandro, is we need to involve big tech more. The telecom companies and the broadband companies are central to this. But you know what? There's another class of providers who've profited massively from the internet tech revolution, who are in the schools, who provide and sell devices, who are an enormously wealthy component of the problem, who have to be part of the solution. I'd like to see us find more creative ways to get big tech on the team for solving this and sharing in the burden and the expense of how to fix it. Then finally, as I think I alluded to in my earlier comments, we need people like you. This needs a community collective action support system. You know, if there's a low-income family or Hispanic family or Latinx family living in Brooklyn somewhere, and we get them the service and we get them a device, if we just walk away from them and there isn't a community infrastructure that will help with education, skills, tech support, all kinds of other things, then we're sort of kidding ourselves we're making the world better for them. We're just sort of handing them a car sometimes that they don't fully know how to drive and expecting them to figure it out. And I just think that that's an uninvested portion of the problem that we'd like to be a partner with groups like yours on.
That is very well put. And I really just want to thank you again, Michael, for such a great conversation. I think for your help and your leadership in this issue. And I think we're just about out of time. So I really want to thank everyone that's joining us from home for tuning into this conversation. Please make sure to follow Michael Powell and NCTA both on Twitter. I'll make sure to share the information in the video description below. And also please make sure to follow HCTP on our social channels at HCTP Policy to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations presented as a part of this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. And until then, remember to tune into the conversation, speak out, and stay connected because the future needs your help. Thanks again and have a great day.